apparently. A few months ago, we did this series on the gospel and what is the kingdom, what is the gospel. And we talked about that, it feels like the first half of the year. And one of the things we talked about is that in the tradition many of us grew up in, the gospel was Jesus died for your sins so that when you die, you can go to heaven. I keep wanting to say you can go to hell, but you go to heaven. You can go to heaven when you die because Jesus died for your sins. That's the gospel. And one of the things we talked about is that is not wrong so much as it's too small. The gospel is much bigger than that. The gospel is that Jesus is restoring all things. The gospel is the announcement of the kingdom. God is restoring all things. So yes, you are being saved from your sins so that when you die, you can, well, maybe participate in the resurrection and be a part of the new creation. But the gospel is much bigger than that. But the fact that the tradition that shaped so many of us has focused so heavily on this spiritual thing means that Christianity as we've experienced it, sort of bifurcates reality, right? Spiritual stuff is more important than physical stuff. Your soul is more important than your body. Your spirit is more important than your body. And I think a lot of it comes back to this understanding of the gospel. The issue is that is not what the Bible does, and that doesn't seem to be what Jesus did. Doesn't treat the spiritual aspects of you, the intangible, hard-to-define spirit that is inside of you, as more important than your day-to-day living, right? We see this especially in the book of Psalms. We're in a series on the book of Psalms, and today we're talking about a type of psalm called the lament. And the tradition that formed many of it, evangelicalism, has generally not been very good at lamenting. And I think a lot of it is because of this bifurcation, right? But the Bible, I think, endorses this lament. So if you've noticed and you've hung out with your Christian friends and you've gone through something difficult in your life, there's been something hard that's happened in your life, and you tried talking to your Christian friends, it might have gone okay. And you might have gotten some pretty pithy, dismissive sort of responses like, hey, my uncle's dying, and I'm pretty close to my uncle, right? And they say, well, they're going to a better place. That's not the most helpful thing in the world, right? We're not good. The tradition that formed many of us is not good at dealing with human suffering. But the Bible cares very much about it. I appreciate last week Noelle brought to us Psalm 41, and she talked about some difficult times that have come in her life. And Psalm 41 is a lament psalm. And a lament psalm, the core of what a lament is it says, God, my life sucks right now, and what are you going to do about it? Right? That's the core. You can add a lot of other things onto the lament, but that is the thing that makes it a lament. My life is hard. I'm suffering down here. I need you to respond. Often the lament goes beyond that. Often it says, my life is hard. I'm suffering. I need you to respond, and yet I still trust you. You're my rock and my shield, Often laments do that. Psalm 41 does that. Actually, let's look at it. My enemies wonder in malice when I will die and my name perish. I'm in verse 5 right now. And when they come to see me, they utter empty words while their hearts gather mischief. When they go out, they tell it abroad. I feel like it's easy to get lost in this. It feels all biblical, doesn't it? What I'm reading it just feels so much like translated Hebrew or whatever it is that makes the Bible feel like the Bible. But this is stuff that we've experienced, right? When they come to see me, they utter empty words while their heart gathers mischief. Have you been to middle school, right? You saw Mean Girls, right? Many of us have lived Mean Girls. When they go out, they tell it abroad. All who hate me, it hurts. It hurts, and the Bible is aware. All who hate me whisper together about me. They imagine the worst for me. But then you get down to verse 10, and it says, but you, O Lord, be gracious to me and raise me up that I may repay them. Folks, if this wasn't in the Bible, you would say that is a very immature prayer That is not the sort of thing a Christian should be praying. The Lord did not save us to pray for vengeance, you know? That is not what God has done in our lives. But it's in the Bible. And I think it's in the Bible because we often feel that way. If you, in your life, are in a place, when you have suffered, when you have been in difficult places, if you, in that moment, were able to say, God, things are really hard, and I still trust you, but I really need you to intervene. That's okay. That's good. The Bible endorses that. You see it all over the laments. However, if what you can pray honestly is, God, I trust you and I really need you right now because I want to bash their heads in, and maybe you could help me with that, I think God meets you there too. I don't think God's going to deliver on that particular prayer, but I do think God meets you there where you are. I think the lament psalms show us again and again that God meets us where we are. There's psalms often end with this restating of faith, but they don't always. Psalm 88, let's talk about Psalm 88 for a little bit. It's a lament psalm, and it says, God, I'm suffering, and it never says at the end, but yet I trust you. I'm still with you, Lord. It doesn't say that. In fact, let's read some of Psalm 88. I'm going to start in verse 8. You have caused my companions to shun me. You have made me a thing of horror to them. Every day I call out to you, Lord. Why do you cast me off? I'm down a few verses. Your wrath has swept over me. Your dread assaults me. You have caused friend and neighbor to shun me. Folks, the psalmist is blaming God for the suffering. Now let's just ask a theological question. How many of you think God causes bad things in the universe? You think God causes them? I don't see a lot of hands. I think most of us don't think that's what actually happens. But how many of us have prayed, God, why are you doing this to me? God, why are you making me go through this? Right? We've said it. Right? And if that is where you are in your suffering, the Bible, I think, is showing us that God meets us there. The thing is, I think one of the great things about Psalms is it helps us to focus on the spiritual life. We don't do a lot of that on Sunday morning, right? There's usually singing. I guess that's sort of part of the spiritual life. And then there's usually a sermon, which is kind of a lecture, right? It's tends to be more academic, like thoughts, it's in your brain. It's not in your spirit so much. But then all the prayer stuff, all the stuff you do where you actually connect with the God who is invisible, we don't do a lot of that on Sunday morning. So I'm grateful that we're talking about Psalms so that we can do some of that stuff. Because our spiritual lives are often, they're difficult to articulate, God really does show up so often in that still, small voice that Elijah talked about, right? Well, that's why we have so many songs about that, because that's, have you prayed sometimes and you felt God and you don't know how to describe it? And there's a lot of people you wouldn't tell that to, but you've had an experience, right? These things are subtle. I think we are served poorly by the tradition that has shaped so many of us, that has told us to only look for God in these spiritual things and not notice that God is meeting us in these earthly things, these worldly things in our day-to-day life. There's this theologian, James Cone, his name, a black liberation theologian. James Cone's a big deal. And James Cone wrote a lot of great books that, don't get distracted by James Cone. James Cone wrote a book that we're going to talk about today, where he's sort of reflecting on the history of African-American music in the United States. And he says that the black church, sort of before emancipation, before the Civil War, if you look at their music, it's very integrated in the sense that the spirit and the earthly stuff it's all in the same song, right? You can be talking about God and your daily life all in the same song. And he thinks that at the time, the black church was like that on Sunday mornings, you would have heard, if you heard sermons, you would have heard sermons like that, right? Very integrated, soul, body, spirit, all that stuff. But it's as it starts to encounter the white European Christian tradition that it starts to bifurcate more. And it starts to more closely resemble the white European tradition. And actually, I think as you look at Christian traditions around the world, I think you see this again and again, that lots of other strains of Christianity globally are much more integrated in this way. So Cohn then says you start to also see this happen in the music. You start to see this separation develop. There's the sacred church music, and then there's the secular music that comes out of the African American tradition, right? And he says the stuff where you're talking about stuff you can't talk about anymore on Sunday morning, the laments, that evolves into what you and I call the blues. Interesting, right? Why does that matter? It matters because most of the music that most of the people listen to and hear daily is what happens when you take the blues and add 100 years, right? Your Taylor Swifts and your Kendrick Lamars, it's just the K-pop. It's just the blues plus 100 years and, some other stuff. Heck, country music now is more the blues than all the other stuff that led to country music, right? I think the church is not good at lamenting, and part of it is that we have forced laments out into this artificial thing we invented, and we call that secular music now. When we were preparing for this Sunday, Elliot and I were we were talking about what song should we do, and it's Psalms. You should do some church songs, right? So I Googled, give me a list of all the lament psalms, right? And so I had that. And then I went to Apple Music. I was like, Psalm 2. All right, type that in, Psalm 2. Enter. Because I know, so many churches have written a song called Psalm 2. Shane and Shane has a song called Psalm 2. Hillsong has all these people. They've all got one. And then I'm just going to scroll through. I'm going to listen to them and be like, which one really leans into the lament and is, kind of works on a Sunday morning, right? You know what I discovered? I discovered that they will take Psalms like Psalm 41 that has the whole thing. It's got the whole package. It's got the God, my life is so hard. Everybody's mean to me, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And then it has these other parts that are but I still trust you, God. And these Christians are taking out the lament part, and they're leaving the part that's more digestible in church. They're leaving the stuff that's but God, I still trust you even when it's hard. I sort of acknowledge that it's hard, so it's kind of a lament, right? That everybody chickens out. They don't just leave the suffering, even though the Bible does. So we've got this songs that I like, songs that are great. I'm not criticizing these songs. They're great. They're good. But I'm saying that these are almost the only songs we have. This is almost as close as we get to lament, right? Yes, I will lift you high from the lowest valley. Yes, right, that's a good song. But it's not quite a lament yet, right? And if that song has meant a lot to you and means a lot to you, great. It means a lot to me too. But sometimes that song is not enough for us. I think a lot of us have had spiritual experiences with laments, and we did not recognize them because they had the label of secular music on them. I have an example from Halsey, mostly picked at random because it's what I've been listening to lately. Halsey has this song on her most recent album. She says, there's a boy I went... This is written from the perspective of a child, so when you notice a very immature prayer in here, it's written from the perspective of a child. There's a boy I went to school with who had leukemia at 5. Now his parents give him everything. They never yelled or fight. They never make him cut his hair because they're happy he survived and didn't have to clean his room. It was enough just to be alive. When I was little, I was jealous of that same pair at night. So I prayed, please God, I want to be sick. I don't want to hurt those, so get it over with quick. Please, God, I want to be loved. Don't want to be somebody they want to get rid of. How many of us grew up feeling like our parents kind of didn't want us? Our parents weren't really happy we were around? That's not something we usually talk about on Sunday morning. But I think a lot of us feel that way. Some of us did. How many of us still feel that, carry that with us a little bit? Right? I think a lot of us lament with secular songs, and God is meeting us in that, but we don't notice it because we never even think to ask. I'm not praying, like that's not where God, you wouldn't even think to ask, right? I mentioned maybe a year ago, I spoke, and I mentioned that I've been married before, and so I got divorced about 15 years ago, right? And as you can imagine, that was a really difficult time in my life. So I had a playlist loaded on my sweet Motorola Razr phone with USB headphones, and I would walk around Bellingham, Washington, listening to this playlist of super sad songs by Regina Spektor and Feist and like Radiohead and all that stuff. And I would just, these sad, they were all secular songs at the time. I wasn't talking to God. I was not talking to God. And if I did, all I could pray was, God, why are you making this thing happen? Taking no responsibility for the obvious fact that I might have had something to do with the situation, right? But that's what I was praying, if I prayed at all, and I didn't pray much. And yet, I was lamenting with Regina Spektor. I think a lot of us are doing the same thing. And am I doing this to say, go listen to more secular music? Not really. That's not really my point. My point is that Psalms show us that God meets us where we are. And a little bit, the sacred secular divide is made up, and it has blinded you to where God is working in your life. This has gone, I practiced this at home, and this has gone very differently, and is much more concise than what was happening when I was preaching in my backyard at my chickens. That's good. It took too long with the chickens. They ask a lot of questions. Here's what I want to do the last few minutes that we're together. Folks, I want to commend a certain idea to you. God meets us in places that are not tidy. God meets us where we are and where we are available. And I hope that at the best you're praying, God, I trust you, but this is really scary right now, and I hope you're with me, and I need your help, and I still trust you. I hope that that's where you're praying, but I know, and God knows, that we're not all always there, and that's okay for a time. I want to practice lament a little bit, if you wouldn't mind with me. I kind of think it's good to actually do this stuff so that when we go home, we've exercised those muscles a little bit. If you will get in a comfortable position, close your eyes if you're inclined to pray in that way. You know how you pray. Do whatever that is. I'm going to give you a few prompts just so we can practice this a little bit and maybe give you a few seconds with each question. Here's the first question. Where have you had difficulties or suffering in your life? Next question. What difficulties, what suffering is in your life right now? Name those things.